Hey everybody, Alex from SCADAForge here. In this video we're going to talk about buttons in Vision. Here we have the Vision Components Buttons palette screen open up in the Inductive Automation docs. If you go to docs.inductiveautomation.com, you'll find everything you need to know about developing an ignition. We're going to go through all of these different types of buttons in the designer, explain when you might use one over the other, and show some examples of how to use them in your project. We'll go to our designer, we'll go to our Ignition 102 Vision Components, we'll create a new window, call it Buttons. That will open up a root container. Let's make this a little bit bigger, give us some room to work with. And we will come over to our component palette and we'll focus on the buttons section. Now we're going to break these down into a few different types of buttons. We'll have what I would consider to be Boolean or discrete buttons, which would be your checkbox and toggle. So your checkbox and your toggle, those are used for setting something on or off, typically a bit, so a 0 or a 1 or a true or a false. Then we'll have what I call Boolean plus. These would be your momentary, your one shot, your two-state toggle, your multi-state, and your radio buttons. And then what I would say are more advanced buttons than simply Boolean or Boolean plus would be your button object and your tab strip. So let's get into the Boolean buttons first. Those will be your checkbox and toggle. So to add a checkbox to the screen, we click and drag to our root container and drop where we want it. And this gives us a checkbox component on our screen. Now if we come to our properties, we can give it a name, call it checkbox. It's currently enabled and visible. We'll leave some of the appearance as default, and we'll leave all the layout and everything as default as well. For a checkbox, the main thing that we need to be concerned with is the selected property. That will basically take whatever this checkbox state is, 0 or 1, or true or false, and allow us to tie that to a tag or use that in scripting or whatnot. So here we have a checkbox tag under our buttons folder. We'll just copy that path. We will tie our selected property to a tag path. We will paste that in here. And we'll select bidirectional so that it writes to the tag. And we'll hit OK. And then we can go into play mode. And we'll look at our value of our checkbox tag here. It currently matches the checkbox status itself because it's unchecked. When we go to check that, it sets the selected property to true. Because we have bidirectional selected on our tag binding, it writes that to a value of true as well. The other main piece that we typically use for checkboxes would be our text property down here under appearance. Maybe we're going to have motor start command there. And if we were to tie this to something in a PLC, this gives the operator some indication of what this checkbox is doing based on the text field there. So we'll just move that out of the way. Next, we'll look at the toggle, which is effectively the same thing as a checkbox. We'll click and drag that over to the root container. We'll rename this to button toggle. We'll see we basically have the same properties as the checkbox with the selected property and the label in this case instead of text. This will allow us to change the text on the button. Here it says toggle button on this property and it says toggle button on the button. Let's call this motor stop command. And that will update our text on our button here. And we have a toggle tag. In this case, we'll make this a Boolean value. We'll copy our path to that. And once we have the toggle button selected, we'll go to our selected property binding, tag, paste that in, go bidirectional, and hit OK. Now when this is toggled off, it will give us a value of false. When we click it and toggle to true, we'll see the button status changes graphically here to indicate that we are selected, and we see our value is true. And if we click it again, the value goes false. So it's effectively a checkbox that looks a little different than a checkbox, which may be useful for operator interface considerations or design considerations. So now we will dive into the more advanced buttons. We'll start with a momentary. Click and drag to the screen. Again, we'll rename this to button momentary. We'll look at the properties. We'll leave a lot of them standard. We'll just leave the text as momentary button. If we update that, it will change the label on the button. Now the way that a momentary button works is we have a control value and an indicator value. The control value is what we bind to. That's the tag that we want to write to when we click this button. The indicator value is the status that we want to read back from whatever tag. Typically, we would take the control value and bind that to a tag, say a start command for a motor, and then bind the indicator value property to the value of control value. The other more complicated piece of a momentary button is our on value and our off value. So similar to the toggle button where we have true and false, for a momentary button we can have an on value, which is what we'll write to our control value when we're true, and an off value that we'll write when it's false. So for sake of example, let's make our on value 10 and our off value 5. Maybe we're using something in a PLC to run some equipment or start a sequence or something when we have a value of 10, and we skip over that sequence when we have a value of 5. So this allows us to effectively have a more advanced toggle button. Now you see your min and max hold time. This allows us to write the value for a minimum amount of time, and then Ignition will reset that value. So for this example, let's set this to 5,000 milliseconds, so 5 seconds. Now the key piece of information to understand about a momentary button is if you click a momentary button and you write a value and you leave the screen, you say we have a tab strip for navigation and we click to a different screen while we have that clicked. In this case, that would be fairly easy to do with the 5,000 millisecond hold time. Ignition won't necessarily reset that value. There's ways to get around that. You can either force the value to be reset in the PLC, and that would handle any issues with your momentary button getting stuck on, or you can also use a one-shot button that requires the PLC to reset the value, which we will talk about here in a minute. So you just want to be careful with momentary buttons. Depending on how your operators use the system, it may be possible, say you're triggering a motor start command, to get that command stuck because they clicked the button and then they clicked to an alarm screen or something while the hold time was still on. So now that we have our on value and off value set, and we've increased our hold time just to show what we're doing, we will go to our momentary example here, copy our path, bind our control value to a tag, and make it bidirectional, and hit OK. And then we'll go to our indicator value, and we'll bind that to a property this time. In that case, we want to go to the momentary button control value. You could bind that to something else if you have a more complicated system than this. Commonly, we just do that just so we see what the control value is bound to. And if we want to get more advanced, we'll talk about this in other videos. You could go to your style customizer, and we could add our indicator value and some properties. So if we want to, say, change that to green or red for start or stop, we could adjust our background color based on the value of our indicator value here. We'll just show a quick example of that. Let's say we have a value of 5 and a value of 10. Let's make 5 a red background color and 10 a green background color. And we can also do foreground color to make that look a little bit nicer. Just make this white when it's red. Okay. So now we see currently we're in an off state. Never mind the 3, that's just from some testing before this. But if we go into play mode and we click the momentary button, we'll see our value goes to 10 and it holds for 5 seconds. And then it gets reset to 5. So we set to our on value when we click the button. And after our hold time is exceeded, then our off value gets written. We can also use this, say if we want to hold it for more than a second, and this is commonly used for like a jog button. If you want to jog a motor while you're holding the button down, you can hold the button down and we're holding it for longer than a second and we're still writing a value of 10, and either the minimum hold time or however long we're holding the button, whichever is longer, will take precedence. So when I release this, it will immediately reset the value because we've exceeded the minimum hold time. Move that out of the way. Now we will talk about a one-shot button. Now a one-shot button is effectively a momentary button, except the momentary button ignition resets the value. The one-shot button expects the PLC or the device that we're writing to reset the value. We'll just simulate that a little bit here by writing the value manually in the tag browser since we don't have a PLC set up at the moment. Call that one shot. This has a little bit more advanced functionality. Has idle text that shows when it's off, writing text which shows while the value is being written. We can disable the value while writing, or disable the button while writing, so you can't click it multiple times, and we can request a confirmation pop-up as well if we want to. And then this gives us a value, so that's what we would write to. This is similar to the control value on the momentary button, and our set value, which is what we're going to write when we click the button. Let's make our toggle an integer just to show a different example, and let's make our set value 9. And then we will bind to our toggle tag here. Or, oops, no, we want one shot. Make that an integer. Copy that path. Now we will bind that tag bidirectionally. So if you think of this like a momentary button with an infinite minimum hold time, that's effectively what we're doing. Then the PLC or another device or script somewhere would reset that value and allow us to write again. So here we'll click the one-shot button. We're in writing mode and we see our tag value has a value of 9. Now if I want to reset that to 0, then our one-shot button gets re-enabled and our writing text goes away. So we click the button, the PLC operates, maybe starts a motor, starts a pump, opens a valve, etc. And then once that condition is set, the PLC would rewrite this to a 0 and we go back to normal operation. Next, for our more advanced buttons, we'll talk about the two-state toggle. We'll click and drag over to our screen. Call that two-state. Now, similar to the momentary button, this gives us a control and indicator value property, and then it gives us a state 1 and a state 2 value. So it's effectively on or off. Although it's not relegated only to on or off, you can make these be whatever you want them to be. And then you have a current state, which is 0 or 1, based on the two-state toggle of the button. So we have a two-state toggle tag here. Copy that path. Similar to the momentary, we'll bind our control value to that tag path. Make it bidirectional. We'll bind our indicator value to our control value property. And our value's 1, let's just reset that to 0. So let's say our state 1 value we want to be 100, and our two-state value we want to be 200. So since we haven't gone into play mode and clicked anything, it's just acting based on the default values here. Current state of 1 because we're greater than a value of 0. For our state values, and you'll see here, this uses the style customizer by default. So if you want to change what the default looks like, you right click on the component, go to customizers, style customizer, and this gives us a value for our current state tag, or current state property of 0 or 1, and gives us a preview option of what we can do for the background color, foreground color, and text. We'll just leave that as default for now. And we'll look at our two-state toggle tag, go into play mode. We'll click that. Since we were at current state 1, we go to current state 0. We write our state 1 value to control value. And here we see the tag has a value of 100. When we go to current state 1, we write our state 2 value, 200 to the tag, and our color updates based on our current state tag. So this gives you a way, similar to the toggle button we talked about earlier, to toggle between two values without being limited only to a Boolean or a bit value or true or false. We can basically put in any value that we want here. Now beyond the two-state toggle, we also have the multi-state toggle, or the multi-state button. Commonly, this would be used for hand-off auto. Since that comes up by default, that's common in control panels for controlling motors. Either in hand, you're using buttons on a panel to start and stop the motor. The motor's off, so it won't run, or the motor's in auto, meaning the PLC is controlling it. So we will rename that. See, we have the similar basic properties for enabled and visible. We can also set up a confirmation if we want here with a text on a pop-up. And then we also have a states data set that we can click on and look at, and that will allow us to change our control value states, what it shows when it's selected, unselected, what the color looks like, etc. So in this case, our control value is 0. So our selected text would be off. Our selected background would be red. And you see that here on the component. Then we also have a control value and an indicator value similar to the toggle and momentary buttons. So let's grab our multi-state tag path, bind our control value to that, similar to the other buttons, make it bidirectional. Then we'll take our indicator value, bind that to property of control value. And that doesn't need to be bidirectional since it's not controlling anything. Now that we have our binding set up, if we go to our states, we'll just clarify the values we're going to see. If we click the hand button, our control value should get set to 2. If we hit the auto button, it should get set to 1, and 0 should set it to off. And then our buttons display will update according to what we have configured here. So we're in play mode, so we'll hit hand. That gives us a value of 2, like we would expect. If we click auto, that gives us a value of 1, like we would expect. And if we go back to off, it gives us a value of 0. If instead we need this to say be a value of 5 and auto to be a value of 10, we would update that in our states dataset editor. Now if we click hand, we would see a value of 5. Click auto, see a value of 10. Click off, see a value of 0. So that gives you an ability to create multi-state buttons pretty easily. And if we want to have, let's say we want to have 4 states, come into our dataset editor, click add row, and let's say 15, and we want that to say fault. Just as an example, and let's make this a value of purple, and we'll just change our text to match. We hit OK, and then maybe we want to adjust the size of this so the buttons are a little bit bigger. Then if we were to click fault, we would see a value of 15. So you could create as complex of multi-states as you need, depending on your system. Commonly, handoff auto would be one of the most common use cases for this button. Push that off to the side. Now we'll talk about radio buttons. Radio buttons are probably something you've seen in the wild before. They're effectively a checkbox plus some other checkboxes that have some smarts built in. We'll just drag 3 onto this root container for our example. We'll just call them radio 1. Button radio 2 and radio 3. And just so it looks nice, we'll select all 3. We'll click space and align vertical, put 10 pixels between them. And when we look at these, again, we see most of the common options. Similar to the checkbox, we see the selected property. And our text, we'll just call this option 1. Select the second one, option 2. Select the third one, option 3. Now, independently, each radio button acts like a checkbox with the selected property. Beyond a checkbox, any radio buttons inside of a container will be mutually exclusive, meaning only one can be checked at a time. So in this case, all of these exist in our root container. So only one of those can be checked at a time. If we wanted to have multiple radio buttons on a screen that are independent of each other in different groups, we can go and we can add a container to our view. And then let's say we want to copy paste these into our container. We select it and we copy paste into there. And now those show up under our container here. So it's a container within our root container. anything in the root container, which is these first two options, or first three options, those will be mutually exclusive, and then anything inside this container will be mutually exclusive as well. Just to show those, let's do just a line border around that. There's our container with those options. If we go into play mode, we'll see that we can only select one radio button at a time. And within the container, we can select different options as well. So if we had, say, a grid of 16 containers with different options to select things for motors or valves or the process, that would allow us to have multiple groups of radio buttons. Then within this, we'll go back to design mode. We can bind our selected property to different tags. Let's say, to keep things simple for this argument, let's say we want to have radio option 1. And then in this case, we can just copy paste here. Select our folder. You get radio option 2, radio option 3. This will allow us to select which one of those is active. If we want to do something like have a tag, say it's written to a 1, 2, or 3 based on this, we can get into some scripting. We'll talk about that in future videos. So now that we have our tag set up, we will bind our radio buttons to those values. So we have button radio 1 selected. We'll go into our selected property, and we will bind that to our radio option 1 tag, and we will make it bidirectional. We can also copy this binding here, or you can remove it here as well. In this case, we'll copy it from radio 1. Then we will click on the selected property on radio button 2, and we will paste that binding and make that radio option 2. Make sure it's bidirectional. Then we will select radio option 3. We'll go in and we will update that to a value of 3, and we'll hit OK. So now this allows us to control these values. In this case, maybe we have different options in a PLC to control some equipment. If we wanted to write to a single tag based on the selected property, we could get into some scripting based on this. We'll save that for future videos. So if we were to select option 3, we'll see our radio option 3 goes to 1. 1 and 2 are 0. If we select option 2, that resets radio option 1, 2, and 3, gives us a value of 1 at 2 and 0. And finally, selecting radio option 1 sets radio option 1 to 1 and the other 2 to 0. And we haven't done anything with the container tags, but that just gives you an example of how those are set up if you want multiple groups of radio buttons on the same screen. So let's scoot these out of the way. Oh. Containers are a little harder. Component. Oops. Component. Size. There we go. Okay, so that's most of the simpler buttons that exist. Next, we will look at the standard button listed in the component palette as button. We'll click and drag that over. We'll just call this button. And we'll see we have all of the standard options here, including text. Let's just say button example. But you'll notice that we don't have things like a control value on here. That's because a button component, I'll make this a little bigger, is sort of an open book or sandbox of whatever you really want it to do. The main way that we interact with this is through scripting. So if we right click on the button and we select scripting, or you hit Control J or Command J on Mac, that brings up our scripting window where we have a number of event handlers, and we can do different things based on that. Typically for a button, we would have action performed that is fired when the action of the component occurs. In this case, when you click on the button. If for some reason you wanted something different when you click or release, or when you press the button or release the button, or when you enter the button or exit the button with the mouse cursor, you can use those. But commonly we would use action performed on a button to do what we want. The default options based on these tabs are navigation. So if we want to, say, open a window, we want to open the Vision Display Components window. If we want to pass any parameters, we'll talk about that in a future video. And then if we want to close this window, or if we want to just swap to it, or if we want to do a forward and back operation based on how we've navigated through the system, or if we want to close a window, typically that would be useful on a pop-up. That gives us the option to do some navigation. You'll also see if we have something selected in this window, and let's say we have that set up and we're coming in to make a change to this project, we go to the script editor. It will also automatically generate a script based on what other tab data you have available. In this case, it gives us the script we need to navigate to a particular window based on these properties. We can also set a tag value by giving it a tag path and a value we want to write to. That allows us to use a button in the same way as, say, a toggle button or a one-shot button by setting a tag to a particular value. This is pretty rare that I've ever done this, but we could write a SQL update query if we want to. I can't think of an example off the top of my head I've ever used that on a button. In terms of this tab, usually I would do something more complicated in a script. Similar to setting a tag value, you can also set a component property. Similar to writing a tag, you just select what property you want to write to. And then whatever you select here, we'll see set properties blue. It will reset set tag value to no action because only one of the tabs will be active at a time. Most commonly, I would be working in the script editor and doing something more complicated with a button. Maybe I'm going to write a value to a tag, grab the status of something in the system, write something to the database, and update a batch. Or if you're going to do some serial communications, maybe you click the button and send a command to a weight scale to do a tear command or something. There's many different options, and sometimes these can get pretty complex. For this example, we'll kind of go through a simple example you might see in the real world. We will X out of our search here. Let's take a text field, and similar to Vision and Display Components window, we will just call this text button example. And we just won't bind anything to this at the moment because we're not going to write to a tag directly from that. But we will go to our button text tag, copy that path, and we will go into our button example. I'll hit Control J to go into our script window. So when we have action performed selected, we click script editor. That brings us into a script we can set up to write the value or execute the script when we click the button instead of writing a value to a tag or a property. So for this example, let's take the text field we have on the window and write that value of the text field to a tag. So we'll create a text variable. We'll set it equal to our text property of our text field. So that grabs the value of that property, sets it equal to our text variable. We will just do a simple system.tag.write to our button text tag and give it a value of our text variable. And then we'll clear this out by writing an empty string to reset the text field. And then we'll hit OK. So our button text value is blank currently. If we come up here and we write that into our text box and we click the button, we should see SCADAForge pop up here on our tag value, and then this text field should get cleared out, which it does. So that would be a way you could create forms or things that are a little more complicated than just looking at graphics on a screen. And that covers all of the basic button examples. We will save the tab strip for its own video because that's a little more complicated and gets into a few more things than just setting values here and there. So thanks for watching. Have a great day.